Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
So, big news this week. Microsoft released its 2024 Digital Defense Report. So Microsoft has been doing this for a few years now, and it collects a bunch of insights and intelligence throughout the cybersecurity world and then puts it into this report. We have done an episode for the last couple of years on this, and so this is our episode this week talking about it since it was just released. It's broken up into three different chapters. Chapter 1, the evolving cyber threat landscape. Chapter 2, centering our organizations on security. And Chapter 3, early insights, AI's impact on cybersecurity. There's a full report, which is actually phenomenally written. I was not able to read the whole thing, but definitely glanced through the majority of it. There's also an executive summary and a CISO report if you just want the very high points across the whole entire report. Microsoft does have a fairly unique vantage point when it comes to the digital threat landscape. And so Microsoft has billions of customers globally that allows them to aggregate security data from a broad spectrum of companies, organizations, and consumers. Their presence in the digital ecosystem allows them to observe key trends, and they have over 50 years of experience and insight. One of the things that have grown over the years, we used to talk about it a lot with our customers, Adam, but we don't talk about it much anymore. That intelligent security graph, the ISG, now something that started, I think, back in like 2018, 2019 time frame. You know, it's just all these aggregates of signals of our consumer email and Xboxes and desktop OSs, and then all of our enterprise customers, and we aggregate all these signals to try to create this landscape where we have insights of what's going on. And those signals have just grown over the years. This year, there is an extra 13 trillion signals per day from cloud, endpoint, software tools, partner ecosystems that help Microsoft understand the digital threats and the criminal cyber activity. In 2023, there were 65 trillion per day. Now in 2024, there's 78 trillion security signals per day that Microsoft is processing. And with the threat intelligence that Microsoft has, there's more than 1,500 unique threat groups that are tracked, including more than 600 nation-state actors and 300 cybercrime groups and 200 influence operations and hundreds of other things. And then finally, there's 3,400 full-time dedicated security engineers.
34,000.
34,000. Thank you.
Yes.
34,000 full-time equivalent engineers that are dedicated to growing the cyber initiatives that Microsoft has. The team is dedicated to enhancing defenses, developing phish-resistant MFA, and strengthening the corporate network, as well as 15,000 partners that also help with specialized security expertise. So Microsoft just has a very unique vantage point, which is why I think they feel obligated to publish something like this to help with the threat intelligence for defenders.
Yeah, I would certainly say that's the case. And I think back to my very first trip to campus in April of 2017. I'd been with Microsoft all of a month. And by the way, Andy and I both work for Microsoft, if you didn't pick up on that already. Although we did not have a hand in writing this report, we certainly will share it with our customers and we'll discuss it with our customers. My first trip to campus, April 2017, one of the things I was struck by, obviously there's a Cyber Defense Operations Center, or a CDOC. That's where Microsoft protects not only itself, but its cloud customers. And that's expected. But what was somewhat unexpected was the second part of the trip to what's called the Digital Crimes Unit. And the Digital Crimes Unit leverages Microsoft's scope and scale and expertise to help effectively protect the world against cybercriminals. And there's certainly a portion of it that's focused on shutting down things like CSAM, child sexual abuse material, but also when, say, there's a big attack that's happening and there's command and control servers, Microsoft uses novel legal techniques and actually has a team of lawyers who can go into different countries and file different legal filings to take over those domains or take over those systems or to knock those systems offline, and does that even though there's significant cost involved and there isn't a direct return on investment to it, simply because it's the right thing to do if you are someone of Microsoft's scope and scale. And so it goes back to that Spider-Man quote from Uncle Ben in the 2001 version: with great power comes great responsibility. And I think that's where a lot of this comes from with this digital defense report and the digital crimes unit and the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center and all of those sorts of things. It's a responsibility Microsoft has with its great power to have that great responsibility to help protect the broader technology and digital ecosystems. And it's something we take really seriously. And I will say candidly, I take a great amount of pride in when I do go talk to customers that we do have that level of engagement with the cybersecurity community.
So as I talked through some of the highlights of this report, in the full report, there are little sections of each one that will have actionable insights. I'm not going to go over every single one, but I will highlight a few of them that I found that were interesting. So I do recommend that if you have the time to go and download the full report, read through it, because each section has some actionable insights that you can go and take a look at your own environment and implement. So in chapter 1, it talks about the evolving cyber threat landscape, nation state actors. This is always interesting. This year, the most targeted sectors were IT and education and research. Number 1 at IT with 24%. Education and research was number 2 at 21%. And then government coming in at number 3 at 12%. And this was a shift. I think if you remember back to when we were talking a few years ago, especially during the pandemic, that was more like the critical infrastructure and transportation and oil refineries and stuff like that. And now we're shifting over to IT and educational research. I think because threat actors are looking for more data and research material that they can take back and use for intelligence. Education has always kind of traditionally been more of a soft target, I think, at least from my aspect. I know folks who work at the University of Wisconsin, and they have a more decentralized IT aspect. Like each school has their own IT organization that has their own budget, that has their own tools. It's less centralized than an entire organization. It almost operates like a company that has several opcos under it, where they have their own, they're free to govern their own devices and have their own AD and everything like that. So I think when you have that type of organization, it can be a little bit more susceptible to attacks, because you can just get in from one place because they all share a network, right? Like it's not like they don't share just an entire network. And so I think with the decentralizing, and then also like education has been funded less over the last couple of years, and also like they don't want to make it hard for their users, like students. So like implementing different types of security measures, unlike industries like banking, where you kind of expect your users to understand why you're implementing certain security rules and changes, processes. Students may not understand that because they don't think that there's anything that's really critical, so to say, about their education that you need to really step up on security. So I think that is really interesting insight. Ransomware continues to be a critical cybersecurity concern. Microsoft observed a 2.75 year-over-year increase in human-operated ransomware. Although the encounters have risen, this is important to note, the percentage of organizations that have ultimately been ransomed or reached that encryption stage has actually decreased more than threefold over the past 2 years. There has been more ransomware activity, but the end result has actually decreased, hopefully because of tightening of the security processes and rules. One of the things for actionable insights here that the report did talk about is some EDR solutions provide tamper protection, which Microsoft Defender for Endpoint does, and some other ones do as well. And this is something you do want to enable and then alert on for any type of policy changes, because if you enable tamper protection, specifically like with like Defender for Endpoint, it prevents security setting changes even if you are a local admin on that machine. So you can't just uninstall the EDR agent, you can't just turn off the AV service, stuff like that. So that's something that you can take back and take a look at. When it comes to fraud, financial fraud is on the rise. One type of alert, I thought this was kind of funny, is called the tech scam, which tricks users by impersonating legitimate services or using fake tech support ads. I wrote in my notes, what's old is new again, because this has been something that has been happening for ages. I remember when I worked at Best Buy, back in 2013, people were doing it over the phone. They were saying, hey, I'm Microsoft support, like, please install this virus, this malware, and we'll help you, do whatever. And so there has been a surge in tech scam traffic by 400% from 2021 to 2023, which far outpaces 180% rise in malware, 30% rise in phishing. Actionable insights, there was a list of them. I thought this one was super interesting. When using voice as a factor for authentication, be sure to incorporate additional factors due to the rise of AI audio models capable of reproducing individual voices. This one stuck out to me because the platform that we use to record started using AI for this podcast, and Adam was being cheeky and tossed in like, I don't know what it was, like the Declaration of Independence or something like that, and had it read back in my voice, because obviously our platform has hundreds of hours of my voice to model it after, and it was scary. The result that came back, it sounded like me reading the Declaration of Independence, and I did not read it. And so definitely when it comes to AI voice, this is technology that is, I would say, mature enough that you can easily scam someone. I'll take a pause there before we go into identity and social engineering. Do you have any thoughts on, because I talked a whole lot there, Adam.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, the shift in targeted industries, for lack of a better term. You pointed out when we first started covering the digital defense report, it was more focused on critical infrastructure, that sort of thing. And now the targets were number 1, IT, number 2, education and research, and number 3, governments. Governments make sense. Education makes sense. IT, I'm curious to unpack, or maybe if they unpacked it more in the report. I wonder if that means more like software and digital platforms, like companies you would think of that make technology products. And that would make a ton of sense, especially with the rise of supply chain attacks we've seen as of late, or the foiled supply chain attacks. Like, remember the wild story about the Microsoft engineer uncovering a supply chain attack in like XE or some like Linux compression command line tool. And he noticed like it took like milliseconds longer to boot up, and he started digging in the code. And this person had been committing good code for years just to sneak in this malicious code very recently, and they caught it before it went production. That would make sense as a potential target for nation state attackers to focus on. So I thought that was interesting for sure. I was surprised at the drop in customers actually getting ransomed, or organizations getting ransomed, by more than threefold over the past 2 years. That is surprising. And I guess everyone listening or watching this show should maybe take a quick victory lap. Certainly, I know ransomware has been a hot topic of conversation every time I talk to folks. And apparently all the efforts we've been doing has been working. So that's really encouraging. We know with cybersecurity that it's a bit of a cat and mouse game. So if we have really leaned in over here and done a good job of mitigating that risk, there's another risk they're going to find and start to exploit. So we never get to sleep, but it's nice to have a win for sure. The fraud stuff, obviously, yes, the voice call out is excellent. I'm not familiar with a lot of solutions that leverage voice as a factor, but if you are using it, it's basically been defeated. So you at least at a very minimum need a second factor. And then certainly, yes, financial fraud on the rise, tech scams. What's old is new again. Perfectly summarized, Andy. It's been around forever. those pop-ups saying, oh, you need to call Microsoft support. And it's definitely not Microsoft, by the way, telling you got to call this 800 number, and then you get socially engineered on top of it. So, man, it's exhausting sometimes being in this industry, but it sounds like there are some wins, so we'll take them. And then it sounds like some things are continued areas of focus for industries that continue to be a focus, like education, and attacks that continue to be a focus as well.
There's a big section on identity and social engineering attacks in the report, and identity-related attacks have surged. Again, I think back to what's old is new again, because identity a few years ago was always like, that's the gateway and that's the new vector for attack on stuff. And it's on the rise again, because as companies have migrated more and more to the cloud, adversaries are using these compromised credentials to access these critical resources. So Microsoft Entra data shows password-based attacks make up more than 99% of the 6 million daily identity attacks. Over the past year, Microsoft has blocked 7,000 password attacks per second, highlighting the persistence and pervasive nature of these threats. In the actionable insights, it's as if someone writing this report listened to the Blue Security podcast before they wrote the actionable insights. I will go over them because there were many, but if you've listened to this show, these will sound like old hat to you. Retire passwords in favor of phish-resistant, passwordless authentication methods, such as passkeys. Allow access from only managed and compliant devices. Enable MFA in all your tenants. Enable phish-resistant MFA for your admins. Provide help desk staff training on identifying social engineering attempts. Evaluate and strengthen help desk password reset procedures. Engage in regular tabletop exercises, and then vet key suppliers related to SIM cards and help desk services. So the last few I thought were really interesting, specifically around the help desk, because that has also been a very critical vector that some of these attacks have been able to get through by leveraging, a password reset or some sort of SIM swap attack, or even like if you outsource your help desk services, that may be another vector of attack. So really good actionable insights. I only copied down and pasted a few of these in here. Definitely recommend going over that. And then the final thing that they talked about in the landscape was the rise of DDoS. And DDoS attacks, or distributed denial of service attacks, continue to evolve. And in the second half of the year, Microsoft mitigated 1.25 million DDoS attacks, which is a X increase compared with last year. And the shift towards application layer attacks poses a greater risk to business availability, such as online banking. And these types of attacks are stealthier, more sophisticated, harder to mitigate than the network level attacks. So I thought that was really interesting when you start to get at the availability. It kind of reminds me of the latest CrowdStrike incident, where it really wasn't a cyber attack, so to speak, but it really affected the availability of a lot of systems, which can have a significant financial repercussion to the business. So DDoS attacks is not something to sleep on, and it looks like Microsoft is seeing a higher view in this. And so like if you do have applications that are available, like publicly facing, you definitely need to have some sort of DDoS service protecting that if it is critical to your business.
More large numbers here. 7,000 password attacks per second, 600 million daily identity attacks. Persistent and pervasive is how they were described, and that certainly matches up here. It highlights overall that although humans will remain a critical part of cybersecurity, we need to ruthlessly automate, shorten our time to detect, our time to respond, and leverage any sort of AI or automation we can to help deal with the volume and veracity of these attacks. Just truly staggering numbers that it's hard to even really wrap your head around. I love the insights here, and Andy, I love the call out that they're very familiar to listeners and viewers of the show. Nothing to add, really. I liked the call out on vetting key suppliers related to SIM cards and help desk services, because we have seen attacks recently. MGM Resorts that started with a help desk social engineering attack. SIM swaps remain a risk for almost every organization unless you've completely eliminated any sort of SMS second factor from not only your environment, from other vendors that you leverage, which has been hard to do because SMS is still really popular for a lot of those. So it's great advice. In general, 99% of attacks were password based. The less dependent you are on passwords and the more you are able to mitigate the risk of passwords, the better off you'll be. So I said on our previous show, when we just did a show about passwords, how password plus 2FA is really considered a mitigating technology. It's not a destination technology. And this kind of reiterates that point. When you get to the fact of there isn't a shared secret and there isn't something to hammer 7,000 times per second, you're in a better spot. So moving towards eliminating passwords is something we all have to put in the work. And it starts with credible alternatives, as I have repeatedly said on the show. So even if you're like, well, we're not ready to go passwordless, great, start somewhere. Tell us what the rough edges are. Discover what the rough edges are for you in your organization and start working through them. You can't get to the destination without starting the journey. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, as the saying goes. So get started. DDoS attacks, 4x increase. I mean, another example of just the growing threat landscape and how everything is just bigger and faster and more. And yet we're being asked to do the same with what we already have, with the headcount we already have, with the level of investment we already have. And so that's why we have to work smarter, not harder, as we always say. Application level attacks, much more insidious to deal with and challenging, not just flooding the zone with junk packets, but maybe actually starting to make an attempt to sign into the system or take an activity in the system and doing that repeatedly. Much harder to reject if it looks like legitimate traffic. It's just doing it at an overwhelming level. And how can you block the malicious while making the service continue to be available for legitimate customers? Really, really challenging stuff, and something that will need to continue to be considered in your application design and how you secure those application design as well. So that probably a growing challenge our listeners and viewers will deal with in the coming months and years.
In chapter 2, it really talks about centering the organization around security and strategic approaches to cybersecurity. Organizations really need to look at their technical debt, any type of outdated security controls, shadow IT, while implementing up-to-date security, data security policies to stay resilient, especially with the rise of generative AI. And I think we've talked about it on this show, where data security has really just been something that a lot of organizations have not been willing to tackle until recently. I think I've had more data security discussions than I have this year than I have in the past 3 years. So it's combined. And so I think that is something that a lot of organizations are looking at. Supporting the ecosystem. This section talked a lot about OT security and special considerations to improving the security posture within that. Microsoft is seeing a lot of new trends that are increasingly impactful towards OT security. And then there was an entire section on passkeys. And I thought this was super interesting because the industry-wide efforts to eliminate passwords in favor of phish-resistant authentication are gaining traction, and passkeys represent the most significant collaborative effort thus far. So, we briefly have discussed passkeys on this podcast, but in general, instead of using a vulnerable secret or potential identifiable information, passkeys use a private key that's stored on the user's device. So it is a device-bound key, and it only works with the website or application which the user created it for. And the same user can unlock it with biometrics and a PIN. So the passkey can't be tricked into signing into a malicious lookalike website because it's not usable unless the user is present and consenting. So this makes passkeys phish resistant as a form of authentication. So under the actionable insights, I thought this was really something that was good advice. So as consumers, we should look for the passkey logo to identify websites or services that support passkeys, and then create and use passkeys whenever possible. As security professionals, we should give vendors feedback to help shape the future of passkeys. Ask whether they support passkeys and explore whether their implementation supports your use case. And then finally, as software developers, you'll want to visit the FIDO Alliance website for resources on how to add passkey support to your website, your app, or your service. And so really great actionable insights. I was thinking about it from a customer point of view. Like if I was trying to buy a new solution, I would ask, do you support passkeys? Like that should be something that is top of mind. Like Microsoft Entra does support passkeys, and there's significant investment on that end to make it more available for different things. Like, for example, syncable passkeys is not available today. That's like where a single passkey can be synced from one device to another to sign into the same application, but it is coming. It's something on the roadmap. So, I know from Microsoft's standpoint, they're making significant investments in that. One of the things that I'll talk about finally in this chapter that I thought was really interesting was a takeaway of understanding attack paths for threat-informed defense. And it had this really great graphic. So if you have time to go through the report, take a look at it. But it talks about like attack paths where organizations should identify the most likely attack path leading to a critical asset and then continuously mitigate those attack paths. Basically, you need to know where your crown jewels are, because the percentage here that is on the graphic is less than 1% of organizational assets are of high interest to attackers. People think like all their stuff is valuable. Everything is sensitive data, but that's not true. Like email, not all your email is sensitive. If I email Adam and say, hey, where do you want to go for lunch? Nobody cares about that. Attacker's not going to care about that. But if I email him like, hey, like how much money did customer so-and-so spend on this solution this year? That's more sensitive. That's probably something that we want to keep internal. Less than 1%. So you got to identify where your critical assets are and then understand how attackers can get to it. 90%, it says right here, 90% of organizations are exposed to at least one attack path. 61% of those attack paths lead to a sensitive user account. So, and then 80% of all organizations have attack paths that expose critical assets. I think this is super important. If you don't have a way to look at attack paths and understand where your critical assets are, this is a significant gap, I think, that a lot of organizations have.
Covered a lot there again, Andy. Great stuff here. Passkeys, of course, we love passkeys on this show. We recognize there's still some rough edges around them, but again, this is how we make them better. We provide this feedback to the vendors we work with, and they provide feedback back to the FIDO Alliance and to the industry-wide consortiums that are building these things, and make them better for everyone. And that's how we get them to a place where we can do broad deployment of them. And as we've mentioned, I think several times in the show, Microsoft did just a couple months ago roll out device-bound passkeys to practically all 200,000 plus employees and vendors in Microsoft in less than 30 days. And yes, they did send out YubiKeys if you really wanted one and didn't want a device-bound passkey, or if you wanted both, which is what I chose. But it's done. We did it. And now I can use my device-bound passkey to authenticate to stuff. And it's a great experience. It's passwordless, scans my face, and away I go. Really, really seamless and smooth experience. And again, for consumers, we're seeing a lot of adoption of these. And now with Apple rolling out their Passwords app on iOS with the new iOS update, it's becoming mainstream here very, very quickly, where you can stand up a passkey and expect it to sync between all your Google devices if you're in the Google ecosystem, all your Apple devices if you're in the Apple ecosystem. And Microsoft announcing recently that plans to do the same by creating integration between Authenticator and Edge to do that same sort of passkey synchronization. So you can create a passkey on a Windows PC, it'll sync to your Authenticator app, and then you can use it on your mobile devices as well, which is also a great experience. So, and if you use a password manager, you've had this now. 1Password does a great job with passkeys and is very friendly with them. So it's an exciting time. It's not 100% yet. I've seen some people on Twitter still poking holes in how passkeys are implemented. And I mean, to me, it's kind of like, look, it's the best chance we have to improve on using passwords. And so let's find a path to yes while providing constructive criticism. But just saying this is a non starter, I don't think is helpful because there isn't another technology on the horizon that appears to have the broad acceptance behind it that this does. So I think for our listeners and viewers, the takeaway is pretty clear that you should be evaluating passkeys and you should be finding use cases to implement them. And if you don't have major blockers, somebody's got to be the first big Fortune 500 organization or just enterprise organization to roll this out, or even if you're in a small and medium business, roll this out to your people. It's ready to go, in my opinion. Yeah, there's some rough edges, but you can work around them, and that's what you got to be doing to learn them. So great stuff here. And then on the attack paths, man, that was some really interesting data that Andy shared, and I'm just going to reiterate a couple of them just so you can hear them again. 90% of organizations are exposed to at least one attack path, but 80% of organizations have attack paths that expose critical assets. So that means an attacker can get a foothold in your environment, and there's probably a way, you think of like the Candyland board or something, where if they take the right steps, they can get to that critical asset. They can get to the secret blend of 11 herbs and spices if you're KFC, or they can get to the Coca-Cola recipe or whatever the case may be for your organization. And so having something that does attack path analysis helps you visualize it and helps you start to cut off those lines of movement is a huge benefit to you in an organization. And really the only way to achieve that, in my humble opinion, is having solutions that have a broad enough visibility to do that. And can see all the potential angles. So not that this is like, you need to go buy the Microsoft solution, but certainly one of the benefits of the Microsoft platform is we do have that visibility across endpoints and identities and messaging and cloud to help visualize all those different attack paths and potentially shut them down. So definitely, I think of as I've been in the industry now for coming on 8 years, there was everyone had to get EDR, and then everyone had to get CASB, and then everyone had to get SASE. Maybe attack path management is the next big thing. And organizations need to invest there and understand that and start cutting those off at the knees. And that really helps when you think of a defense in depth strategy of, hey, an attacker may get in, but they can't go very far. That's effectively as good as keeping them from getting in the first place if they don't have a lot of room to.
Yeah, just like with the ransomware, right? Like we see more ransomware attacks now, but getting to the point of encryption has decreased, which is a win.
Correct. Exactly right. Great analogy. Great comparison.
Yeah. So the final chapter is talking about AI's impact on cybersecurity, and Microsoft has definitely seen the AI threat landscape evolving, and threat attackers are using things like AI-enabled spear phishing, resume swarming, and deepfakes as part of their tool set in their attacks. AI has been good for security operations and defense by improving threat detection, response speed, incident analysis, and they're providing defenders with significant advantages against sophisticated attacks, and also enabling more efficient management of cybersecurity operations. I think we talked about on this show already just how much time was saved when our podcast recording platform implemented AI, and how much time I used to, hours, 3 to 4 hours per episode editing manually. And now AI does it in 10 seconds, literally. I click a button and it's done. And that's the type of speed I think AI can help enable defenders, right? Like where you're manually looking through different logs or you're not sure where to get started. AI can help aggregate all that data. I really think that if you're at an organization and you're not using AI as part of your security operations, that you are at a significant disadvantage. Because the way that I've seen it work, and specifically in this type of arena, now AI is not great for everything. Mm-hmm. It just isn't. But for this, where you have a ton of data and you need to sort through it, AI is phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you really do need to have some sort of AI defense, because attackers are using AI, and that's what this report says. Governments and industries are also collaborating on AI security regulations, international standards, and collective defense initiatives to ensure AI responsible use. And then they're trying to mitigate the risk posed by malicious actors using AI cybersecurity attacks. One of the really neat graphics that is in the report is adversarial use on AI and influence operations. And the big ones that they listed out here are China, Russia, and Iran and proxies. China has a lot of capability when it comes to using AI in influence operations as well as cybersecurity attacks. They are very good at audio and video generation, image generation, and they're somewhat capable in text generation. Same thing with Russia, very, very good capabilities compared to China. And then Iran is more lower on their capabilities, but they're still using it. So it is definitely something that nation states are using, and as defenders, we need to be aware of that.
Yeah, I think it's fair to have a skeptical, cautious approach to AI, which I would expect most security defenders to have skepticism towards anything, because it's kept you safe. And so that healthy sense of skepticism, I would imagine, permeates most of our listeners and viewers. However, if you look at it, you'll understand that yes, there's a hype cycle here, but there is also real, true value to be had. As Andy talked about, saving both of us tremendous numbers of real person hours that we no longer have to spend getting the show out every week is real. And I think makes for a better show. And yes, sometimes it doesn't work 100% perfectly, but we now use AI to do things like cut out pauses, mute the person who's not talking, even remove some of the ums and ahs from the show. And that's at first did not work well at all, and now works pretty well. To reduce the pauses between our words to help the conversation flow more smoothly, to automatically select the camera of who's speaking, or to kind of flip back and forth when one person's making a long-winded point and catching the face of the other person. That's all automatic. What about the automatic captions that make the video more accessible to people with listening impairments or other disabilities? Or what about the automatically created show notes that make sure we don't forget to put stuff in the show notes, but also do a great job of capturing the theme and the concepts of what we talked about? That is real value. That's not a flying car. It's a real thing, and we're getting it today. And it can bring benefits like that to security defense as well. As Andy talked about, if there's one thing we've proven large language models are really good at, it's summarization. It's every LLM demo ever. What's the first thing they demo? Summarization. Well, that's great because we are working with just enormous volumes of data that humans cannot reason over, but computers are really good at. And if I can summarize and say, pick out the anomalous components here, it's something LLMs are fantastic at and is super easy to do. So that's like using the technology for something it's really good at. And oh, by the way, what's the other thing it's really good at? Writing excellent, well-formatted English text. Sometimes it can be verbose and sounds like a high schooler trying to pad out their book report. But if you're not an English speaker, native English speaker, and you want to write convincing English language, you now have a treasure trove of tools to do that. You think of every phishing training you've ever had. What does it coach you on? Look for poorly written language. Look for mistakes, grammatical errors. If I have technology that can help me write perfect English, it makes those fakes that much harder to detect. And adversaries are using that today. And this talks through this great image Andy talked about in the report about the adversarial use of AI in influence operations, and talks about China making an AI-generated cartoon, or Russia putting out an AI-generated audio of Elon Musk narrating a fabricated documentary. Like it is something that's being used in multiple ways. And no, that doesn't necessarily mean you also need to use it for defense, but you should, because there are capabilities today that just make a ton of sense. And as we talk through in this whole podcast, and we shared these big numbers of ransomware attacks up X or 2.75x year over year. And we talked about cyber fraud up, and password attacks are up, and DDoS attacks are up, and everything is up. Everything is more. Everything is growing. We need to do more with less. And I know that's a tired phrase, but one of the things that enables us to do that is leveraging technology for good. And so I would say we're not meeting our responsibility to our stakeholders in our organizations, or our fiduciary responsibility, if we're not evaluating in any and all tools that can help us better secure our organizations. And I think it's clear today that, yes, again, AI is going through a hype cycle, and some of it is a little futuristic, but there are real use cases and real value to be had today. And it's incumbent on you as listeners and viewers to go find those use cases and share them with your organizations and implement them in your organizations.
Yeah, I just was thinking in my head of an example, and this might be just somewhat exaggerated, but I almost think like, we're like security defenders, and we're using like the single load musket in the Civil War, and the adversaries are using like a machine gun, right? Like it does the same thing. We're doing the same thing, shooting bullets, but like we are a lot slower, we're more methodical, but they're able to just, fire. If they're using AI and we're not, it's like we're using that single load musket and they're using a machine gun.
Love the analogy.
So, all right. Well, we'll have the link to the full report, as well as, if you want to download the executive summary or the CISO summary, in the show notes. That's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. Adam and my contact information will also be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.